About a very dark time in history that occurred in Europe during the last century, called the Holocaust. The 20th century will always be remembered as the best and worst in history. It will be known as the best for its technology, ingenuity, science, and medicine that saves and prolongs lives. All these great advances by humans were also used for evil. Dictators used the same science and technology to carry out mass killing on all types of people, even their own. In the 20th century alone, more than 120 million humans were killed, murdered, slaughtered in ways you can only imagine, which was partially due to the younger generations being indoctrinated by the sick-minded leaders and tyrants. You see, a young child is like a young tree. The way you shape a young tree will define how it will grow. And that was the results in Germany from 1939 to 1945 by the Third Reich. It really started a little earlier. On November 9 and 10, 1938, the Third Reich launched a program against the Jewish people. It is known as Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. More than 900 synagogues were burned down, over 100 Jews were killed, 30,000 men were deported to concentration camps, and 7,000 Jewish businesses were destroyed. It was also an attempt to see if there was going to be an outside reaction. As we all know, there was not. Even the USA refused to let in and save desperate refugees fleeing Europe. They were turned back to their home country to be murdered. In the history of the world, this was the first time an attempt to completely eliminate an entire nation. Every single Jew was targeted. It was not about territorial assets. This was murder motivated by anti-Semitic ideology. It is almost 80 years since the end of World War II. So why is it still so important to talk about the Holocaust? Because the Holocaust is a human story, a story relevant to us all. It was perpetrated by humans being against human beings in the center of civilization.
I can't hear you.
Just a little bit.
I can't hear you.
The Holocaust raises deep questions of morality, ethics, and human behavior that continue to echo today, October 7. Is a reminder. We should not see it as a murder of 6 million anonymous Jews, but rather than 6 million times an individual Jew was murdered. Nazi Germany and the collaborators did not just murder the Jews, they made every attempt to dehumanize them. Today, I'm here to talk about my family experiences during the Holocaust, just because we were Jewish. 29 years ago, after my mother passed away, I realized that World War II generation is disappearing fast. Very soon, there will not be any witnesses to the atrocity that took place in Europe from 1939 to 1945. There will only be stories that were passed down to future generations. As you all know, during the Second World War, Hitler, his commanders and collaborators across Europe were taken by hatred and crippled by human weaknesses. They systematically segregated, transported, and murdered millions of people. The Holocaust was the systematic industrialized annihilation of 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime. Of the 6 million, 1.5 million of those murdered were children. Before World War II in 1933, approximately 9 million Jews lived in 21 European countries. Those countries became occupied by Germany during the war. By 1945, 2 out of every 3 European Jews had been murdered. The European Jews were the primary victims of the Holocaust. We ask ourselves, how could one group of people, a people that was so modern, so intelligent, and so sophisticated, become so hateful and so brutal to another human race, mostly the Jewish race? Until recently, most people knew only about the Nazis. However, there were others. For example, the Ukrainians and especially the Romanians. Since history, there have always been wars between tribes and between nations. However, never in such a large scale as World War II. I personally was too young to remember all of it, but I lived through it with my family. And here is my story. Chernowitz, January 22nd, 1941. It was the happiest day in my mother's and father's life. The first child was born. It's me. Unfortunately, the joy did not last. Backing up to July 1940, after the Soviets issued an ultimatum demanding the return of 2 provinces, Bessarabia and Bukovina, from the Romanian, which was occupied by them since 1918 after World War I from Austrian control. The capital of the province Bukovina is Chernowitz, the city I was born in. Chernowitz is in the Ukraine. The city was also called Little Vienna because of its rich culture, because it was occupied by Austria early on. In Romania, the retreat from Bukovina and Bessarabia was met with anger and humiliation by the Romanians. Anti-Semitism was set aflame by propaganda blaming guess who? The Jews, of course. Horrible pogroms were staged in many Jewish areas. 1940 and 1941, this was their opportunity to show their true colors. For example, Nazi Germany prepared each stage of their plan with systematic scientific methods. The Germans organized camps where death was quick and sanitary. On the other hand, the Romanians were more barbaric. They did the killing in the city on the streets. There were times when the Nazis intervened to stop the slaughter perpetrated by the Romanians. Back in Chernowitz, when I was 2 months old, my father was made to enlist by the Russian army to fight the Nazis. During transport, the train that he was on was attacked by German bombers. My father did not survive. July 5th, 6th, 1941, Romanian troops entered Chernowitz with the help of the Nazis, of course, invaded the Jewish quarters and began cleansing the city of Jews for 24 hours. The army invaded courtyards, cellars, attics, and shelters indiscriminately, shooting anyone they found. Gendarmes, that's the Romanian police, rounded up another 3,000 Jews and dragged them to the dungeons of the gendarmerie. The victims were beaten throughout the day, body searches were made, women were subjected to general inspection and welfare, men were sent to slave labor. Hours later, the Chernowitz ghetto was established. October 1941. 50,000 Jews were forced out of their homes and herded into the ghetto, allowed to take with them only what they could carry. Meantime, a large territory in the Ukraine, 16,000 square miles, was designated for annihilation of Jews. The name of this territory is Transnistria. It means beyond the river. There were like 2 sides. It looked more like Florida, really, with water from both sides, 2 rivers. The territory consisted of about 132 Ukrainian towns and villages. Why was this territory picked? the Romanians knew that the Ukrainians hated the Jews just as much as they did. The transportation started with clubbing, beating, and shoving into overcrowded cattle cars. My immediate family did the best they could to stay together. My mother, her parents, 4 of her brothers, and her sister, also my father's mother. Many of those who reached the crossing point alive were simply driven into the river and gunned down by machine guns. However, the majority was transported across the river on bridges, overcrowded barges, and rafts. Transnistria was like no concentration or war camp. There were no barracks and there were no gas chambers. What Transnistria had was hundreds of miles of fields. Transnistria was a killing field, a giant forgotten cemetery. Territorially, it was the largest killing field in the Holocaust. During the day, we were forced to march from village to village, town to town. My mother carried me, and when she tired, my grandmother took over. At night, we looked for a barn, a shed, anything for shelter from the bitter winter frost of 40 degrees below zero, covered with rags and newspapers. Others exchanged their clothes for some food from the local farmers. Many of them died naked and barefoot from the cold. Thousands were ordered to dig enormous mass graves and were shot. Those who dumped the bodies into the graves were shot after their jobs were done. At times, the earth would move from people buried alive. If you ask me how I survived, pure miracle. Until my 4th birthday, I suffered from typhus, malaria, scarlet fever, to name a few diseases. My only nourishment was nursing for my starving mother. One time, in desperation for food, my mother snuck out in the middle of the night to a nearby farm looking for some scraps of food that were left by the pigs. A Nazi soldier found her and hit her over the head with a rifle. He left her being dead, but she survived. She had a lump on her head until the day she died. Out of the 150,000 Jews that were deported, 90,000 perished. Over the 300,000 local Ukrainian Jews, 185,000 were murdered. In 1944, the Russian army liberated our camp. Only a handful from my family survived. My mother, grandmother, and aunt were the only ones that survived Transnistria from my immediate family that stayed together. The rest died of starvation, cold, and diseases. After liberation, we returned to our house in Chernovitz that our neighbor kept for us. After not being able to immigrate to Israel, at that time it was under British occupation. The Russians didn't allow it, of course. A year later, we immigrated to Romania. It was right before the Russians locked their gates from leaving. You see, Romania was a satellite of Russia. In Romania in 1947, a prominent active communist Jewish lady admired by Joseph Stalin by the name of Anna Pauker became the foreign minister of Romania. May God bless her soul. She went against the grain when all other Soviet satellites had shut their gates to the Jewish immigration. She supported and helped facilitate the immigration of over 100,000 Jews to Israel. From that spring of 1950-1952, my family was on top of that list. In Romania, we befriended a wonderful man that was taking care of his elderly mother. Before the war, he lived in a town nearby our family. He was also a Holocaust survivor. He fell in love with my mother. But my mother was still in denial that her husband was dead. Even after a friend of my father who survived the bombing of that train that my father was on told her that he was dead. And I was not much of a help either. I liked him, man, but I was selfish and did not want to stepfather. Almost a year after we immigrated to Israel at age 10, I all of a sudden grew up and came to my senses and gave the stamp of approval and convinced my mother to marry that wonderful man. When I was 11, my little brother was born. And in fact, he lives in Jacksonville also with his family. Shortly after finishing my service as a staff sergeant in the Israeli Navy, I went to Montreal, Canada, and stayed for 3 years. In 1965, I immigrated to the state for better economic reasons. In 1969, I married my wonderful wife, Hannah. And in those 56 years, I was blessed with 3 daughters and 6 grandchildren. Surviving there and having a family is my revenge for the Holocaust. Also, I was the only survivor from my father's side of the family. I have been living among, Jacksonville, wonderful community, for the last 39 years. Around this time, a few years ago, before I came here to speak, it was a few years ago, into